Ladies and gentlemen, let us consider the curious paradox of kindness, a virtue so universally praised, yet so often misunderstood. Kindness, by its nature, seeks to give rather than to take, to uplift rather than to diminish. Yet, in the hands of a world that prizes power and self-interest, this noble quality can sometimes seem a dangerous liability. Why is it that the very light of kindness, meant to warm and illuminate, so often invites shadows of disrespect? The fault, I submit, is not in kindness itself, but in the nature of the human heart. For there is within us all a temptation to mistake gentleness for frailty, generosity for gullibility. When a person extends their hand in kindness, there are those who see not the gesture of grace, but an opportunity to take without giving. The giver is labeled weak. Not because they lack strength, but because their strength is of a kind unfamiliar to those who measure power only in domination and resistance. Furthermore, kindness without wisdom may falter in its effectiveness. To give indiscriminately, to always yield without regard for one's own dignity, is to invite the illusion that kindness has no boundaries. The world, when unchallenged, will take the path of least resistance. It is not malice but a kind of inertia that leads some to push where no pushback is felt, to demand where no limits are set. But let us not lay all blame at the feet of others. Those who are kind must also examine their own hearts. Is their kindness truly born of love? Or is it tinged with fear? Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of standing alone? A kindness that seeks merely to placate, that hesitates to speak truth or enforce justice, will inevitably erode the respect it once commanded. For respect, like trust, cannot thrive where integrity is sacrificed even in the name of goodness. Yet the world is not so dark as to be entirely unredeemable. There are those who recognize kindness for what it truly is, a quiet, unyielding strength. To these souls, kindness is not a weakness to exploit, but a gift to cherish. And for those who do not yet see, let the kind-hearted remember this: true kindness does not demand approval, nor does it shrink in the face of disrespect. It stands firm, rooted in the knowledge that to love and to give is to live in the image of something far greater than ourselves. So let kindness remain steadfast, not because it is always understood, but because it is always right, and let it walk hand in hand with wisdom, so that it may shine with a light that commands not just affection but respect. Kindness, that most noble of virtues, bears within it a paradox that is both perplexing and profound. It is, on the one hand, celebrated in word and song, held aloft as a beacon of what humanity ought to aspire to. Yet, on the other hand, it is too often subjected to misunderstanding, even scorn. How can a quality so universally admired lead, in practice, to disregard? The answer lies not in the nature of kindness itself, but in the peculiarities of human perception. For kindness, by its very essence, is an act of humility. It seeks no accolades, no triumphs. It is content to give without expectation, to serve without demand for recognition. And herein lies the rub. In a world that frequently measures worth by the strength of one's assertions, by the firmness of one's grasp, the quiet and unassuming nature of kindness can seem, to some, a deficiency rather than a virtue. When the kind-hearted extend their hand, they do so out of a genuine desire to uplift, to share, to ease another's burden. But there are those who, failing to see the strength in such a gesture, view it instead as a sign of submission or self-doubt. They mistake the absence of pride for the absence of resolve. They fail to discern that true kindness is often an act of courage, a defiance of the self-centered impulses that govern much of human behavior. Thus the paradox emerges. That which is meant to elevate and ennoble is, by the eyes of the unwise, diminished. It is not that kindness lacks power, but that its power is of a different kind, subtle, unseen, and therefore too easily overlooked. The world, in its preoccupation with visible displays of force, too often misjudges the quiet strength that resides in the hearts of the truly kind. And so the very quality that should command respect becomes, in certain quarters, a source of disregard. Yet the fault lies not with kindness, but with those who lack the vision to see its worth. It is a curious flaw in human nature that we so often mistake the gentle for the weak, the humble for the timid. Kindness, though it springs from strength, is all too frequently perceived as frailty. The kind-hearted, in their desire to bring light to others, walk with a quiet dignity that does not boast, does not demand, and does not seek to dominate. Yet this very quietness can lead others to misunderstand, to see in kindness a void rather than a virtue. Consider the man who offers help without hesitation, the woman who listens without judgment. To the discerning eye, these are marks of inner fortitude, a confidence so deep it has no need to assert itself. But to the undiscerning, the story is different. They seek not strength, but surrender, not magnanimity, but meekness. For in their own hearts they equate worth with noise, power with control, and respect with fear. They do not recognize that true power lies in the ability to extend a hand without demanding anything in return. Thus kindness becomes, for some, a blank canvas upon which they project their own insecurities. If kindness does not retaliate, it must lack courage. If it does not seek to conquer, it must lack ambition. This misperception is not so much a failing of the kind-hearted as it is a reflection of the distorted values of those who cannot see beyond the surface. It is a sad irony that a virtue so pure can be met with so much misunderstanding. The kind are often treated as if their willingness to give is a license for others to take, their gentleness is an invitation to dominate. This, of course, reveals far more about the taker than the giver. For to mistake kindness for weakness is to confess one's inability to recognize the quiet, unyielding strength that resides in true goodness. It is a blindness, not to the act itself, but to the heart that performs it. There exists a troubling tendency in the human heart, a tendency to exploit what is freely given. When kindness is extended without demand for repayment, it is met, by some, not with gratitude but with a kind of casual entitlement. This is the opportunism of the ungrateful, the readiness to take without giving, to accept generosity while forgetting its cost. And so kindness, that most selfless of virtues, becomes, in the eyes of the opportunist, not a gift to be honored but a resource to be consumed. The roots of this behavior are found in a failure to value what is not earned. To the opportunist, there is little distinction between the kindness of a friend and the abundance of nature or the rising of the sun. It is simply there, dependable and uncomplaining, requiring no effort on their part. And because they do not work for it, they do not cherish it. They assume that the fountain will never run dry, that the giver will never falter, and that kindness by its nature must always flow unchecked. This presumption leads to a tragic outcome. The more freely kindness is given, the more it is taken for granted. The kind-hearted are met not with admiration but with demands, not with respect but with expectations. Their acts of grace are treated as obligations, their willingness to give mistaken for an inability to refuse. It is a grim irony that those who give the most are often valued the least. Yet this pattern reveals more about the taker than the giver. For to exploit kindness is to betray one's own poverty of spirit. It is to fail to see that kindness is not a weakness to be manipulated but a strength to be emulated. And while the opportunist may prosper for a time, they ultimately impoverish themselves. For in their greed, they lose sight of the richness that comes from reciprocal respect and mutual care. They consume the kindness offered to them, but they fail to nourish the soul from which it springs. There is a peculiar danger that lies in kindness without limits. While the generous soul seeks to give freely and without condition, this unbounded generosity can, paradoxically, create an illusion in the minds of others, a false belief that the kindness offered is inexhaustible and requires neither acknowledgement nor restraint. In failing to set boundaries, the kind-hearted risk teaching those around them a most unfortunate lesson that they will always yield, no matter the cost. Imagine a river that flows through a barren land. At first, the river is seen as a blessing, a source of life and sustenance. But as time passes, those who depend on it may cease to marvel at its gift and begin to take its presence for granted. They build their lives around it, drawing from its waters without thought of conservation or gratitude. Should the river dry up, they are bewildered, even outraged, not realizing that their unrestrained use played a role in its depletion. So it is with kindness when no boundaries are set. The kind-hearted, in their desire to help, may give endlessly, forgetting that even the most abundant well must be replenished. Their refusal to say no, to place limits on what they can offer, is often misinterpreted as an inability to do so. Others, seeing no resistance, may assume there is no need for restraint, and so they push further, demand more, until kindness is no longer a gift but an expectation, no longer a virtue but a duty imposed. This is not malice, necessarily, but a form of thoughtlessness, a failure to consider the humanity of the giver. Yet it is a failure that leads to a subtle erosion of respect. For respect thrives on mutual recognition, on the acknowledgement that both giver and receiver are equally deserving of care and consideration. When kindness becomes one-sided, when it flows without regard for its own limits, it loses its capacity to command that recognition. Thus, the kind-hearted must learn the delicate art of setting boundaries. For kindness without boundaries is not kindness at all, it is a sacrifice that, over time, diminishes both the giver and the receiver. To give wisely is to ensure that kindness remains what it is meant to be, a reflection of strength, a source of connection, and a light that does not fade. There is a subtle, almost imperceptible force at work in the human heart, one that often leads people to exploit kindness not out of malice, but out of inertia. The world, left unchecked, follows the path of least resistance. It is a law of nature that what yields is often pressed upon, and what does not resist is often pushed further. Kindness in its purest form seeks no confrontation, makes no demands, and imposes no obstacles. And in this very quality lies its vulnerability. When the kind-hearted extend their generosity, they create a space where others feel at ease. They do not demand repayment, nor do they remind others of the debt they owe. This freedom, while noble, can give rise to complacency in those who receive it. Without boundaries or a firm reminder of the cost, people grow accustomed to taking. At first they may hesitate, aware of the gift being offered, but over time, as the kindness remains steady and unchallenging, they begin to assume it is endless, unearned, and unconditional. They do not stop to consider that every act of giving requires effort, every word of encouragement springs from care, and every gesture of compassion carries a weight unseen. This is not to say that those who take advantage of kindness are inherently cruel or selfish. Often they are simply unaware. They do not pause to reflect on the humanity of the giver, on the strength and intention behind their acts. Instead, they follow the path that feels most natural, the path of least resistance. And in doing so, they fail to recognize the quiet strength that makes such kindness possible. Yet this unthinking inertia can have profound consequences. The kind-hearted may begin to feel drained, their gifts unappreciated, their efforts unnoticed. Worse still, they may find themselves disrespected, not because they are undeserving of respect, but because their kindness has been mistaken for passivity. For in the absence of limits, respect withers. Without a clear sense of when kindness begins and ends, others may fail to value it at all. To break this cycle, the kind-hearted must remain vigilant. They must recognize that kindness, to be truly effective, must sometimes resist. It must set boundaries, demand recognition, and insist upon balance. For only then can kindness shine in its true light, not as a weakness to be exploited, but as a strength that uplifts all who encounter it. It is a curious thing how the world often mistakes stillness for emptiness and gentleness for an absence of resolve. Kindness in its essence offers a path free from thorns. It seeks not to entangle or obstruct, but to ease, to guide, to uplift. Yet, in this very nature lies its vulnerability to a peculiar human tendency, the inclination to press further when met with no resistance, to demand more when given freely, and to take without pause where no obstacle stands in the way. The human heart, when left unchecked, follows the easiest course, much like water finding its way downhill. Where kindness flows unguarded, some will tread boldly, not out of malice but out of a thoughtless assumption that the giver requires no rest, no gratitude, no recognition. They see not the labor in the act, nor the strength in the offering. Instead, they perceive only the absence of struggle and interpret this absence as a void to be filled, a license to proceed without care or caution. This is not necessarily born of ill intent. Many who take advantage of kindness do so without ever realizing it. They do not see the quiet courage that kindness requires, the deliberate choice to offer instead of withhold, to lift instead of weigh down. They are blind to the strength it takes to remain open-hearted in a world so often harsh and unforgiving. And because they fail to see this, they slip into habits of expectation. What was once received with surprise and gratitude becomes routine, assumed, and eventually disregarded. The tragedy lies in the erosion of respect, for respect is built not merely on admiration but on an understanding of mutual effort, of give and take. When kindness flows in one direction without acknowledgement or reciprocation, it ceases to be seen as a gift and begins to be treated as a given. And where something is treated as inevitable, it is rarely valued, let alone respected. It falls, then, to the kind-hearted to be both wise and watchful. Kindness is not a commodity to be expended without thought, nor is it an infinite resource to be tapped without end. It must be paired with discernment, with the ability to say enough. Not out of selfishness, but out of a recognition that even the most generous spirit has limits. For only when kindness is balanced with wisdom does it retain its power to inspire respect. And only when it is met with acknowledgement and care does it fulfill its highest purpose to build bridges, not to be walked upon. There is a danger, subtle yet profound, that lies not in kindness itself but in the motives that often accompany it. True kindness is an outpouring of love, a deliberate choice to place the needs of others alongside or even above one's own. But when kindness is driven not by love but by fear, it becomes something else entirely, something weaker, less resilient, and ultimately less respected. Consider the person who says yes to every request, not because they are eager to help, but because they are afraid to say no. Their kindness, though outwardly generous, is rooted not in strength but in a desperate desire to avoid conflict, to appease, to maintain peace at all costs. They give not freely, but out of a silent dread that rejection or resistance might lead to discomfort or alienation. In this way, their kindness becomes a shield, not a gift, a way to deflect confrontation rather than an act of genuine care. The world, sharp-eyed and ever-watchful, can sense this difference. People recognize when kindness is offered from a place of freedom and when it is offered from a place of fear. And while the former inspires respect, the latter often invites disdain. For kindness that arises from fear lacks the quiet confidence that marks true generosity. It appears hesitant, self-serving, even insincere. And in a world that values courage, even if it is misguided, such kindness is seen as an easy target for dismissal or exploitation. This is not to say that those who act out of fear are to be condemned. Fear is a natural part of the human condition, and it is not surprising that many of us allow it to influence our actions. But kindness born of fear cannot command the respect that kindness born of love so effortlessly commands. For fear, by its very nature, seeks to avoid rather than to confront. It compromises rather than stands firm, and in doing so it undermines the very integrity that respect requires. The remedy, then, lies in the heart of the giver. Those who are kind must ask themselves, why do I give? Is it because I truly wish to help, or is it because I am afraid of what will happen if I do not? Am I acting out of strength, or am I seeking to hide my vulnerabilities? These are difficult questions, but they are necessary ones. For only when kindness is rooted in love for others, yes, but also love for oneself, can it shine with a light that commands respect. And only then can it fulfill its true purpose to uplift, to connect, and to reflect the best of what it means to be human. There is a subtle danger in kindness that seeks harmony at the expense of truth. To be kind is a noble thing, but when kindness bends so far as to abandon justice, integrity, or honesty, it ceases to be a virtue and becomes something hollow, something fragile. A kindness that fears to offend or avoids confrontation may achieve a temporary peace, but it does so at a cost measured in the erosion of respect. Consider the one who, in their eagerness to avoid conflict, agrees with everyone and opposes no one. They smooth over every disagreement, not out of conviction but out of fear that asserting themselves might disturb the fragile equilibrium of their relationships. Such a person may seem amiable, even generous, but over time their unwillingness to stand firm begins to reveal a troubling truth. Their kindness is not anchored in strength, but in a reluctance to face discomfort. They sacrifice truth on the altar of peace, and in doing so they undermine the very foundation of trust. For respect grows not from kindness alone, but from the interplay of kindness and conviction. A person who is kind but unwilling to uphold what is right, even when it is difficult, becomes like a tree without roots, easily swayed, offering no shelter when the storm comes. Their kindness, while soothing in the moment, is ultimately unreliable, and reliability, more than charm or even goodwill, is what commands respect. The world, with its unerring instinct for weakness, often reacts to such misplaced kindness with disregard. People sense when someone is more interested in placating than in pursuing what is just or true. They see through the veneer of harmony and recognize the underlying fear, the fear of rejection, of conflict, of standing alone. And while they may appreciate the comfort such kindness provides in the short term, they do not admire it. For admiration is reserved for those who balance kindness with courage, who extend goodwill not as a substitute for truth, but as its companion. The kind-hearted must therefore guard against this tendency. Kindness must never be used as a mask for avoidance or a shield against confrontation. It must be rooted in a deeper strength, one that allows for discomfort, for disagreement, and even for the risk of rejection. For only when kindness walks hand in hand with integrity does it inspire true respect. It is not enough to be agreeable, one must also be steadfast. And it is this steadfastness, this quiet commitment to both truth and love, that elevates kindness from a mere pleasantry to a virtue of enduring power. Kindness at its heart is an act of generosity, a giving of one's self for the benefit of another. But when this generosity is given indiscriminately, without regard to its context or recipient, it risks being squandered, misinterpreted, or even disdained. There is a truth that is both sobering and essential to understand. Not everyone values kindness, and not every situation is worthy of it. To pour kindness into a vessel that does not hold it is to waste its beauty, and worse, to risk it being trampled underfoot. Imagine a pearl cast before those who cannot see its worth. The pearl is not diminished by their failure to value it, but the act of casting it there invites misuse. So too with kindness given to those who neither appreciate nor respect it. When kindness is shown to those who operate by a different set of values, those who see life not as a place for mutual care, but as a game of domination and advantage, it is often seen as a weakness to be exploited. Such people may interpret acts of kindness not as expressions of strength, but as signs of vulnerability, mistaking generosity for gullibility. This is not to say that kindness should be withheld as a matter of principle, for the essence of kindness is its willingness to give without expectation. But wisdom must accompany generosity, for without it, kindness can become a liability. To give indiscriminately is to misunderstand the nature of true kindness, which is not merely about giving but about discerning where giving will do the most good. Kindness, after all, is not indulgence. It is not blind. It does not enable harm or perpetuate folly. Rather, it seeks to uplift, to heal, to strengthen. When kindness is given without discernment, it invites not gratitude but entitlement. Those who receive it without reflection may come to expect it as their due, losing sight of the effort and sacrifice that kindness often entails. And in this expectation, respect is eroded. For respect requires an acknowledgement of the giver's choice, a recognition that kindness is not an obligation but a gift freely given. Without this acknowledgement, kindness becomes invisible, and the giver, in turn, is taken for granted. The kind-hearted must therefore learn to temper their generosity with wisdom. They must discern when their kindness will nurture and when it will be wasted. This does not mean withholding kindness from those who do not immediately deserve it, for the transformative power of kindness often lies in its ability to reach the undeserving. But it does mean knowing when to protect their gifts, not out of selfishness, but out of reverence for their value. For kindness, when given wisely, does not diminish in the giving. Instead, it grows, creating a world that recognizes its worth and respects those who embody it. There is a paradox that surrounds kindness, one that often leads to its misinterpretation and, regrettably, to its misuse. Kindness, by its very nature, seeks to make others comfortable, to ease burdens, and to create a sense of peace. But in doing so, it sometimes fosters complacency. The recipient, lulled into comfort, begins to mistake kindness for convenience, viewing it not as a deliberate act of care but as an effortless, natural state. This failure to recognize the effort behind kindness can lead, all too easily, to disrespect. To be kind is to extend oneself, to give of time, energy, or emotion in a way that asks for nothing in return. But this selflessness is not without cost. It requires sacrifice, even if that sacrifice is willingly borne. Yet to those who receive kindness repeatedly without pause for reflection, the cost becomes invisible. They grow accustomed to the acts of generosity, seeing them not as gifts but as givens. And where there is no recognition of effort, there is little room for respect. Consider the friend who always listens but is never heard, the colleague who always helps but is never thanked, the family member who always gives but is never considered. Over time, their kindness becomes a backdrop, a constant presence that is noticed only in its absence. And herein lies the tragedy: what is constant is often taken for granted, and what is taken for granted is rarely respected. This dynamic is not born of malice, but of habit. People grow used to the kindness of others, just as they grow used to the air they breathe or the sunlight that warms them. They forget that these blessings, though freely given, are not owed to them. And in forgetting this, they fail to honor the giver. Respect, after all, is rooted in acknowledgement, in the recognition that another's actions are neither automatic nor obligatory, but chosen. The kind-hearted must recognize this tendency and guard against it, not by withholding kindness, but by ensuring it is not offered to the point of invisibility. They must remind the world, gently but firmly, that their kindness is a choice, not a requirement. This does not diminish the generosity of their spirit, rather, it elevates it, making it clear that kindness is an act of strength, not an inevitability. For when kindness is seen as a choice, it is valued. And when it is valued, it is respected. Kindness, though a virtue of profound beauty, is often misunderstood because of its quiet nature. It does not demand attention or proclaim its worth. It moves gently, seeking to heal, to comfort, to uplift. Yet in its very gentleness, it risks being overshadowed by louder, more forceful qualities. In a world that often admires strength displayed through dominance, kindness may appear weak. And what the world perceives as weak, it is all too ready to dismiss or exploit. This misunderstanding is compounded by the fact that kindness often chooses to step back, to allow others to shine, to put the needs of others first. While this selflessness is noble, it can inadvertently create a perception of passivity. The kind-hearted, by making themselves small, so that others may grow, may find that they are overlooked, their contributions unrecognized, their presence undervalued. And where value is not seen, respect cannot flourish.